What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name's Philip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorp. And I'm going to admit up top, I have no idea how to describe this book.
Yeah, today the book is definitely hard to describe, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't check it out. We talked to Elizabeth Stintz, who is a non-binary and trans writer and poet behind the books Junebat and Vanishing Monuments. Their latest novel, My Volcano, is about a volcano popping out of New York City before, well, a lot of other weird things. This was a really challenging and interesting novel in that, like, there's so many different moving parts, different characters. It's kind of surrealist, and it captures. I think Jess kind of says that they were trying to make this kind of feeling of doom scrolling on Twitter while reading this book, and it definitely captures a lot of those, I think, anxieties packaged within like this kind of bizarre climate change, apocalyptic, absurdist piece.
Yeah, I feel like that's exactly right. Like once, they kind of started talking about the idea of, oh, this is supposed to feel like, doom scrolling. A lot of the pieces feel like they fall together for this piece where it's like, yes, that's exactly the feeling, because, you'll the overarching motif is that the volcano is popping up in the middle of New York City. Suddenly it starts to feel normalized. People are talking about anything else. And there are other things that are kind of happening in the periphery. There's a piece about, like, there's a Borg creature that's slowly, like, coalescing and taking over consciousnesses. There's a woman who discovers that she's trapped inside of an insect, a really big insect. And so there's just, like, all this stuff that kind of flies at you. And Phil, kind of over the course of reading this book, you and I would send segments back and forth and be like, oh, this is really good. But then, sometimes it would be so hard to talk about it or make sense of it, or, try to decide what was going on. And so it really, I think, does a good job of kind of mimicking or mirroring that feeling of scrolling through Twitter, and you're just bombarded with all of this stuff, and you're not even sure what's real here. How do I make sense of it? And so, yeah, I just really think that Jess just captures that essence in some ways of feeling, overwhelmed and unsure, but in a really, I feel like they say this, and I feel like we should say this too. It's enjoyable. It is an enjoyable experience. I feel like it's a good experience. It can sound in the ways that I'm talking about it like I'm dogging on it, but I think it's a really positive thing what they've been able to pull off here.
Yeah, and it's like, it's almost hyperbolic at this point when somebody says, like, this is going to be unlike anything you've experienced before. But, like, I mean, straight up, I have read a lot of books. I have 2, master's degrees in English, and I can say, like, I don't think I've read anything like this novel. I don't really foresee myself reading something that's very close to it. And I forget if it was in this interview or one of the ones that we were reading in prep for the interview. But Jess even kind of went on record talking about how they wanted to make, like, the weirdest book possible. And I mean, I think they accomplished that. It is really unlike anything I've read. And just one thing I really appreciated about it was just, like, on a sentence level, it's so beautifully written. Like the moment to moment parts of the book are really astounding. And it's really interesting to imagine how hard it must have been to continue that level of quality in the prose throughout this novel, because like we're saying, it's like it's so weird. I don't know exactly how to say it any differently than that. So it definitely is a feat in creativity in that way.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think they do really, really well, and we get into this, is finding you'll start with a premise that feels really strange and off-putting and bizarre, and they always are just able to kind of zoom in on a good kind of emotional core. Like, here's why you care about this thing. It's not. I feel like that's maybe another thing to get out of the way, is that it doesn't feel like it's a book that is weird for the sake of being weird. I think it often finds ways to make those the weird things feel really resonant and meaningful, and that even like, you know, you can. Again, this book is so much easier to talk about in terms of themes, but you start with this premise of the volcano, which should be apocalyptic, world's ending. It's popping up in the middle of New York. It should be shifting so many people's lives. And again, I think in the same way that events today do this in our daily lives, where it's like there's something off in the distance happening, but you just woke up inside a bug. And so like that's actually the main thing that you're worrying about, even though it's personal and small and doesn't bleed into this larger thing about the volcano in New York City. And so I think it balances this feeling of going through personal crises while also feeling like there's this massive looming thing that nobody's quite talking about that's happening off in the distance. And so it's absurdist, but it also feels like in some ways it just really perfectly captures our very absurd moment that we're living in.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, Ben, you summed it up perfectly there. So how about we just jump right into the conversation? Again, this is John Elizabeth Stintzi, and we are talking about their new novel, My Volcano. Jess, John Elizabeth Stintzi, is a non-binary and trans writer, educator, and visual artist who grew up on a cattle farm in northwestern Ontario. Their work has been awarded the 2019 RBC Bronwen Wallace Award for Emerging Writers and the Malahat Review's 2019 Long Poem Prize. Their writing has appeared in Ploughshares, Kenyon Review, Fiddlehead, the Malahat Review, Best Canadian Poetry, and many more. Jess is the author of the novels My Volcano and Vanishing Monuments, as well as the poetry collection Junebat. They live with their wife in the United States. Thanks for coming on, Jess.
Hi, no, thanks for having me.
We always like to start off the podcast with kind of asking how people are doing, especially during the turbulent times that we're in right now. So, how's it going?
Oh, turbulent. Yeah, I mean, in all sincerity, it's been kind of a rough semester, and it's been a rough, early 2022. So, and I've got a book that comes out in a few days. I don't know. It's a very strange time for me. It's always, I think, odd to sort of put things out in the world. And also it's, I think, bringing back the memory and the sort of like trauma of my last two books coming out in like April and May of 2020, and we're still in a pandemic, and my third book is coming out. So I don't know. It's a lot of feelings.
Does the process of release get less stressful? Do you feel more familiar with it now, or does it stay about the same?
I don't think it's actually stressful. It's just like emotionally weird. I mean, it is stressful in some way, but it feels like so disconnected for me also. I don't know. It just feels like it's like now I get to see how much people do or don't care about this thing that I made. I think it's stressful because of that, but it's not. I don't think it's as stressful for me in the way that it's stressful for other people. Maybe, I don't know. I've got a lot of. I just feel so weird when it comes to these things, and it might just be the pandemic as well. So it's like, I think this time hopefully I will be able to sort of have the little moments that make it feel real in a way that I didn't get to do that. Like I'll have my first virtual event for any book in like a couple weeks. I mean, not virtual, like in-person event. Like that's wild to me. The third book finally gets a real event. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I can only speak for I've published like creative nonfiction essays and stuff online. I've never, had like an in-print publication, and I'm curious, from my own perspective, when I publish something online, there's that level of it feels like you're throwing it out into the void, and depending on if you get responses or not, it can be hard to parse, my relationship to the work in those settings. And I'm curious, is that kind of the vibe that you feel with kind of releasing books during the pandemic, or if not, maybe can you speak a little bit more in terms of how it feels a little bit different, or maybe bigger?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely, I think it feels somewhat similar. in the sense of like I've published many things in many magazines, and you'd be surprised the names of places that have gone out to nothing. Like, I mean, I've published in very good magazines and not heard a peep from basically anybody about them, and I've published random things online and gotten nice responses. So it's like, it's very much a mixed bag. You never know what you're going to get. Sometimes the void is not where you think it is, but I think with books, it's a little bit different. I think obviously the stakes are higher, but it's also, I think it's like weirdly comforting to know that at least people read books in a way that people don't necessarily always like go and read like literary magazines and stuff, which, you know, no shade on them, but, you know, I think it's something that is a little bit more natural for someone to like pick up and be like, okay, this is the thing that someone actually like sits and reads. So if they pick it up, you know, usually they feel a little bit more compelled to read it, maybe. I don't know. But it is, I don't think that like throwing it into the void necessarily goes away exactly. I think that's sort of always part of the process, especially as like a literary writer. Like, you kind of just have to know that for the most part, most people aren't going to read your stuff. And that's just part, you know, and you can't write for that. Like, you can't write for the idea that you're going to get read by a bunch of people. Otherwise, you'll lose your mind. So thankfully, that's not why I do it. But yeah.
How do you think about, you know, motivation there and finding a way to be like, okay, this is something that's valuable. This is what I'm going to spend my time on, even if it is. And sometimes it is where it's like 2 people read, maybe 1 person comments and is like, hey, I really like that.
Yeah. I mean, it's you just have to make yourself the only reader that really matters. I mean, that's like the end of the day. Like, you write for yourself, and if other people like it, that's great. And if other people like it, you'll be validated in that sort of like, oh, other people are like me, and that's kind of nice too. But yeah, I think that's and I think that's also how you write stuff that's really interesting as well, as if you don't think about the market or don't think about like what other people want you to do, and just think about like what like makes you excited about this project, and like lean into that as much as possible, which is definitely what I did with this recent book with My Volcano. I mean, there was like one friend, like I have one friend, I'm like, you will fucking love this book. And aside from that, like, it's whatever. I mean, like, I'll have written a book that I liked, and it was a fun ride. So I think you just have to like have conviction for your own beliefs when it comes to writing. Otherwise, you will be chasing something that doesn't exist, which is this sort of like big readership, literary fame, which is all luck anyways, for the most part, or very good marketing, which is mostly money.
Well, no, I love that. I think that's a really interesting insight, especially thinking about My Volcano as a novel, you know, this kind of sprawling epic that's like kind of surrealist and absurd and has so many kind of characters and moving parts. I'm curious, maybe if you could take us back to like the genesis of this novel and maybe what you were thinking or what you were attempting to do with this piece.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem with me and genesis of my books is that I've been working on this in some way or another probably for a long time, and like I just have a lot of different projects, and they always like I write like the first little part, and then like I go do something else for a couple of years, and then I come back and I sort of like, oh, this idea has sort of like grown into this, has a sort of possibility. I think that at its core, what brought me the most to My Volcano was this sort of like, I mean, I knew right away, like the earliest part of it was this sort of like short piece that was just all these weird little moments that were sort of set in this world that has this volcano in it for some reason. But that wasn't even the point. Like the point was the little volcanoes in all of these people's lives. And that was always, I think, the impetus for My Volcano, was like, how can I write a book that is about all sort of like collective eruption, but is also about all of these small little parts, these little volcanoes in all of our lives. That was really what it came down to. And then a lot of it was also like, it was kind of like the book that I cheated on my other books with. Like it was like the place that I went when I was like really frustrated, and like I just needed to like write something that was kind of like fun and weird, and just like, you know, basically I would just like have a weird idea and be like, I'm going to write this and we'll see if it fits. And most of it fit somehow. I was able to find a way to make a book where most of the weird ideas fit, which is, I think, a marvel. for me. Yeah.
I wanted to get you to talk about like how do you describe this novel to other people, because I've been, Phil and I were talking about like, or I'll try to talk with my girlfriend about it, and I can get through like the first section. I'm like, okay, so there's this volcano and it's showing up suddenly in New York, and then beyond that I'm like, I don't know where to go from here. And like, Phil and I were talking about, I was just talking about the scene with the girl who's trapped inside the insect and goes on a date with a guy, and then they like start like gearing up to have sex, and then she like bursts out the back of the insect, and they're both like, "What are you doing? Get out of this apartment!" And I was like, how do you have these conversations with people about like, okay, so this is what the book is about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only really talk about it in terms of like thematically and be like, all right, this is the thing that happens. Like a volcano the size of Mount Fuji approximately grows out of New York in 3 weeks, and then weird shit happens everywhere around the world, like following that. And it's sort of like, that's as much as I can really say. Because yeah, once you get into the weeds, you'd be like, all right, there's a person who wakes up inside of a giant insect. There's a Mexican boy who goes back 500 years in the past. There's a weird like Borg sort of like collective growing in Mongolia. It's just like all this weird stuff that once you get into the details, I think it's so, and I think that's part of what I wanted it to do as well. Like in the same way that like I wanted it to be kind of like reflective of like our reality and like all of the weird things that are just seem like, it seems insane to me that we're like having this conversation and like, Russia's invading Ukraine and like all of these, there's a pandemic that nobody wants to say is still going on, and like all these things are all, existing at the same time, which I think is sort of what the book was trying to do in a sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of way.
One. The jogger, the first person to see the peak of the volcano sprouting from the middle of the reservoir in Central Park in the early hours of June 2nd, thought the volcano was a breaching humpback whale. But as split second turned to 2, turned to 5, the jogger didn't see the form rise or fall, and it peaked at only about 8 feet high from the surface of the water. She stared at it for a full minute, stretching all the while, before continuing her run. She couldn't afford to stop any longer because she didn't want her heart rate to drop. By noon, the same jogger would approach a local news crew in the park, saying that she was the first to have seen it. She was. And that her mind first thought it was a humpback whale. On several of the evening news broadcasts, they put a photo of the volcano rising in the park next to a photo of a humpback whale breaching just off the coast of Rockaway Beach, perfectly foregrounding the Empire State Building. Viewers were asked to respond on social media if they thought there was resemblance or not. 2 news anchors believed the resemblance was there, but 4 others didn't. A great many people mocked the jogger relentlessly on Twitter. Near as many people commented on her looks. When asked why she, the jogger, didn't report what she'd seen when she first saw it, she didn't have an answer. She grew quiet. The dead air that followed filled the noise-hungry microphone with the sound of camera mirrors flapping, until she added, "You never think you're seeing something new anymore. I figured it was old news. I didn't want to say anything because someone would tell me that they knew, that everyone already knew. Also, I had 6 more miles to run."
I felt in some ways that it was almost like a balm to like read this after aggressively, as I do, and I know a lot of people do, just like scrolling through Twitter, and you just like you see these popping things of just like here's the most insane thing you've ever thought of, and it's a real thing that is happening in the world right now.
And there's a meme.
And there's a meme, and someone's making fun of it, and someone beneath in the comments is like, "You're a monster for making this joke," and it's just like this constant stream of like different perspectives crashing into one another. And I think the novel does a great job of capturing that, and also capturing, I mean, even in that initial part, the volcano shows up in New York. It's a crazy thing, but almost instantly it becomes normalized. And it's like, oh, well, I mean, it's the volcano in New York. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
And so I think in some ways, it felt like such a piece that is speaking to this moment where it's like feeling kind of rudderless, trying to find your, like solid ground amidst everything being chaos around you. And it's just like, it worked really well, I think, when I was thinking about it in terms of, I go from Twitter to like paging through my volcano, and it feels like it captures that just like perfectly.
Yeah, it is kind of like a novelization of doom scrolling. It's a little bit more. I've said that several times, and I always have to be like, but it's more enjoyable than doom scrolling. Like, it imitates doom scrolling, but it's not like pathetic fallacy in the point where it's like too much like doom scrolling. Like, it's don't expect it to be insufferable like actual doom scrolling. Like, there's a point to it, but yeah. It does have like these sort of interjections of things that sort of like disturb you. Like there's commercials and things like that sort of, and also like bulletins of like real violence that happened in 2016, all the stuff that sort of like peppers in, sort of bounces back and forth. And also someone wakes up inside of a giant bug, and, someone turns into a human kite. There's like just all this weird stuff that, clashes with itself, which is sort of like when you're scrolling through Twitter and seeing all these dumb jokes and, posts about, horrible things that have happened.
Can you kind of talk about, I mean, one of the things that struck me, and we don't have to, I guess it's hard. It's a book that is hard to talk about in specific. This was like, we were kind of panicking about like how to ask you questions about it, because we were like, just the setup you have to do to get to the question can be difficult. But one of the things that I think, I'll just set up because I think it touches so well on kind of what you're doing, is you have the one character, Ash, who finds that they have a separate version of themselves, or a duplicate copy, who is living in a city on the other side of the world. And so you start from this premise where it's like, it's weird, it's strange. But then, what starts happening is they start calling themselves because they're lonely and they need someone to talk to. And so I think one of the things that I felt you do very well is start with, what are sometimes very absurd premises, but then find like a really strong emotional through line. Can you maybe talk about how you were thinking about, okay, hey, cool, so this person's in a bug. How do I find a way to make this resonant?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the challenge. I think what I've cut from the book, which wasn't much, I think it was the stuff that didn't find the way to go beyond its sort of like satirical premise. Like that was something that like, I mean, the challenge of like, it's a funny idea to sort of turn Kafka on his head and be like, instead of waking up as a giant insect, you're waking up inside of a giant insect. So that was sort of what I was playing with Galena, that character. But yeah, I mean, you have to sort of like, I mean, you always have to just sort of know that like your premise will only go so far, and like the humanity is why people will read this book. So, making Galena this sort of closeted queer character and like being closeted within this kind of insect and the kind of freedom that sort of perspective gives her is like really interesting. So it was this opportunity to sort of like, I always had to sort of, I think, take the premise and think, okay, how can I push beyond the premise in a way that makes it interesting? And Ash is a very interesting character. Like his journey is so strange, and it's sort of like and it's sort of like, gives us this way to sort of have this weird link between these sort of parallel universes that sort of start to emerge as you read the novel. So yeah, I don't know exactly like beyond like just an understanding of like the reason people are going to read this stuff is for the humanity, not just for like the funny premise that I have. So I always kind of have to figure out like how I can root that in something that feels real and relatable. Because I think that is also just what makes this sort of writing so fun. Like the sort of absurdity of the metaphors that are so like easy for someone to like latch onto who have like a similar experience. Like I think that's what makes it so enjoyable to write this sort of like kind of fabulous, surreal work.
Yeah, that's interesting. One thing that I was just thinking about every time I picked up the novel was just the form of it. And, Ben and I are both working on I always joke with my partner that I'm working on a longer work without calling it a novel. And it's a really kind of eye-opening process, I think, compared to like writing a like short fiction or an essay. In a conversation you had recently with Prince George County Memorial Library, you talked a lot about form and kind of, my words, not yours, the fluidity of how you approach it between like poetry versus prose versus your visual art. And I love this idea that you talked about of how with your poetry, sometimes the form or like the shape of the piece can feel a bit ephemeral or elusive to you. Like this kind of happens and you have to get it out. Versus fiction, it's much more of like a deliberate process and like a mindset that you're in. For something like my Volcano that has so many characters, I was just wondering, like, formally, like how you kind of went about creating it. You said it took a number of years. I'm wondering, like, were you kind of working on individual characters' stories and you had to figure out how they placed in, or?
I mean, it was kind of fluid, and actually, like, you know, working on it several years doesn't mean that I was actively working on this for several years. I work on a lot of different things. I sort of bounce around. So this is probably actually the quickest book that I've ever written in terms of probably actual like time in the seat, which people will be. I've been recently joking that people are gonna like eventually like just murder me because I think this is the easiest book I've ever written. Like, which, considering how strange it is and how structurally sophisticated or sort of like difficult like to fathom how it's structured, I think it's funny, but I think it was very intuitive for me to write like that. But yeah, it was kind of a mixture of going in and sort of like a lot of it did, I think, come like as I went. And I think I learned early on, years ago when I was writing Vanishing Monuments, that the best way I could write a book is to write the part that was the most exciting to me at the time, and to not necessarily think about like, oh, okay, I need to write the next part of the story. Like, I'll just write. And with my Volcano, I mean, that you could write anything and it could be something that's included. So that was, I think, some of the challenge. But yeah, it was mostly just like, there was a lot of that. And then occasionally I'd be like, okay, I want this character to exist. I think Galena's story, the waking up inside the insect story, was one that I did kind of go through kind of, I was like, all right, I'm gonna write this weird metamorphosis story, and I just sort of like wrote it and then broke it into pieces as I wrote it, and then sort of spread it out. So there were stories that I did do that, like Ash. Like, surprising to everyone who I've ever told this to, Ash was like the last character that I ever wrote. Like, what? I wrote like a month before we went on submission, I added Ash, and it was just like, it's insane to think about that because of how integral he is to connecting so many of the storylines. But like, yeah, like his story was very much like beginning to end, and the White Trans Rider, I think, was also like kind of beginning to end. But a lot of it was kind of like as I went, I just sort of like, all right, I got to go back to what the hell's Duncan doing now? What the hell's this person doing now? What's John Bull up to? Like all these, just kind of as every day, I, sort of thinking about like, oh, what's an exciting thing for me to write? And I think that's also where the kind of parallel universe sort of stuff starts to happen, like where suddenly it seems like we're kind of in several different realities at once, was I think also just like playing with like, but what if this happened instead? And then I have to sort of, so it was a lot of like, there was a lot of outlining. There was a lot of like, I have a spreadsheet that shows like how much the volcano grew every day. Like I had like an equation that I made to make sure that it was like, I could figure out to the exact number, like how absurdly fast this thing was growing, like all these things. Like there were all sorts of like, I have like a character map that's like massive and like has every single person, like how they're connected to everybody else. Like, yeah, like there was a lot of that sort of thing that was involved, for sure. But a lot of it was, and I think in general, like I write kind of hybrid. Like I don't try to do too much outlining. I just kind of go write what's interesting to me. If I get lost, I sort of can do a little mini outline to sort of like get me back on track into figuring out like where I'm going. And yeah, it's a very fluid process. But it is a lot more like, I'm thinking a lot more about structure in terms of the novels. As I said, like the poetry is weird. Poetry will come out as poetry. I feel like I have less control over that. But with fiction, I always feel like I want to say something with the way that the book is put together. Like Vanishing Monuments has this sort of interesting structure. Not like My Volcano, but like, even and with My Volcano, like sort of the way that it starts to get like shifted and shook up like more and more as you go is kind of, me trying to say something more broadly about the work as it goes, by the way that it's sort of like juxtaposing these things much more aggressively as you go. So yeah, it's definitely something I'm more conscious about when it comes to the books.
I wanted to, because you brought up Vanishing Monuments, I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the ways that they are or might be in conversation with one another. I was listening to an interview that you did with, it looks like, Toronto Star, talking about, memory and the way that identity is interpersonal was one of the things that you were talking about, which I really loved. And one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading through this was the way that reality feels like it's interpersonal in this, that in a lot of ways you're thinking about the ways that our reality is often kind of shifting and shaky based on who's telling the story about, where we are in the world. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering if you can kind of maybe bounce off and talk to us about the way those two books are in conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really probably key way that they're sort of conversational. Like Vanishing Monuments is much more about the self and like identity being this thing that's kind of like in conversation with someone. So it's about this character whose mother is suffering from dementia and is sort of like lost the ability to speak, and they go back to their hometown for the first time in like 30 years to see her, and it's sort of about like confronting this person who like can't even see you as who you are anymore, or like there's this and you can't see them for who they used to be. Like there's this real sense of like almost like a social death, like not an actual death, but like this version of me is gone within them, and the version of them is no longer this person that I'm looking at. And there's this sort of idea that who we are is sort of built on how we're being perceived by other people. That's sort of something that I think is just inherently true about the world. And I think that this book is definitely like less about identity in terms of that, but it is definitely like reality as being this sort of like conversation and like is a sort of like agreement between people. And it's not this sort of like, I'm not someone who believes that reality is this very like static, empirical thing. Like I think that that's like an absurd stance to take about like, oh, our experiences are all like inherently like the same. Like I think that I live in a very different world than so many different people. Like I think that we're all sort of living in our own little realities, and I think there are obviously ways that they tie together, and I think that's what Vanishing My Volcano is doing with this sort of like amount of stories and the way that they do touch one another. Like I think it is trying to sort of like there is a line that connects us. There is a sort of collectivity, but I think they're both very much thinking about the ways in which I guess just things are socially constructed in a way. Like I think that is like a through line between those two books, for sure. Yeah, I think those sort of big thematic similarities are probably the most, sophisticated or the best ways that they're connected, for sure.
One kind of question that I've been grappling with a lot through reading the novel is this kind of tension I think that can exist, or like this friction that can exist in a novel like My Volcano, which does have a lot of like surrealist elements, juxtaposed against real world instances of police brutality or white supremacy or any other forms of violence against marginalized folks. I'm curious, like what that experience was like for you, incorporating those kinds of things into the novel, and maybe why was it important to include those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most, like, on its surface, the thing that I'm glad that it does is that it shakes people up and doesn't, like, I never really wanted this book to feel like something you could get like necessarily fully immersed in. Like I wanted it to kind of like shake you up a little. And I think also like, the surreality makes the reality that much more real feeling. And I think that there's all sorts of interesting tensions there. With those specific sections, I kind of hesitate to speak to like intentionality about them, if only because I think that there's such interesting litmus tests for the reader, like moments for the reader to reflect on like, oh, how do I feel about these like real things that are suddenly like in this novel that's set during like the summer of 2016, but these are like real things that happened in 2016. And I think that the reader's response to that like their reflections on their sort of response to that is something I think is one of the more interesting things about this book. So I don't really want to like say like what I was intending with including those, but I think like I definitely wanted them to be sort of like jostling, and I wanted to also assert in some ways that My Volcano is not as fictional as you want to think that it is. Like I wanted it to feel like, yeah, the absurdity of this, but it doesn't feel any less real necessarily. Like it's just as like it's maybe on paper sounds insane, but I wanted it to still feel like this. Like I think I almost at some point was like, should I call it My Volcano a memoir? And I'm like, nah, probably shouldn't do that. So I don't know. I think that's something I was definitely trying to play with. Like I very much as a sort of like one of the ways to sort of like shake up the reader and sort of like make the reader sort of like have to think about stuff that's outside of the book as well.
Can you, I love that idea as far as like a litmus test. I think for me, like, yes, I got to those sections and I was like, whoa, this is kind of making me think about, the reality of these things are happening all around us. These disasters are real. And again, thinking back to the scrolling through Twitter analogy of like, it is, you'll be like, here's a joke, here's someone like, a goofy video. And then it'll be like, oh, here's a video of someone getting murdered. And you're like, what? And so I felt that a lot. I wonder, like, I think in some ways felt uncomfortable sometimes when those names showed up. And I'm wondering if you can talk about like, how do you put those names in the novel? And I don't know, like, is there a degree of, how do you be respectful of, those people and those names juxtaposed next to kind of a fictional piece? How do you, still feel like you're I feel like there's this thing that happens where it's like we sloganize these names, and so that can happen too. And so how do you walk that line for yourself where it's like, yes, this is going to be a part of my, my novel, but I still want it to have this impact without kind of taking the gravity away from the reality of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's also like it depends on like what your opinion of fiction is. Like, do you think fiction is inherently silly or inherently unserious? Like, I don't know. Like, if you think that fiction is somehow less serious, then I can see having those next to, these real events might make those seem less serious. Like, I can definitely understand that. And I think at like the end of the day, like, unfortunately, like as much as I could have not included those names, but like that doesn't mean that those people weren't like didn't have these experiences and like weren't like, this is at the end of the day, like it's that's just like me putting some like real news into a book. Like, I don't know. It's an interesting question, but yeah, I think it depends. Like, I don't think that fiction is any less serious than real life, or like, I don't think that I read it with the sense that like, oh, this is all just made up in some way. So yeah, and I don't know. And I think maybe it's also speaking a little bit to that kind of like how weird it is that these names just become names. I don't know, like, because that's what I mean. Unfortunately, like all these things happen, and they do sort of become like symbols more than people, which is sad. I mean, not that all the people that I listed in that book are people that people have even heard of, but there are definitely some that are.
Yeah. And if I am remembering rightly, I think the one place that it kind of bubbles up beyond just the list of names is when Ash is having that conversation with themselves where they're like, they're talking about the pulse shooting. They're talking about the pulse shooting, and they're talking about their ages, and they're like, do you think about this? And it's like, yes, I think about this all the time. Yeah. No, there's definitely a few moments, and like near the end of the book, there's some sort of, I think there's a little bit of, I hinted that in one of the endings of the book. And Michaela at some point talks about, I think, Antoine Schumpert, maybe, I think it was. I think there are moments where it does sort of break the surface of the book, which I think is also like an interesting, like, thinking about the sort of many layers of reality that exist at the same time in this book. I think was something that I wanted to sort of like really just tear at people's minds with in some way. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when I was reading those sections,
against the other narratives happening. Something that I was really thinking about throughout the whole novel is just I really resonated with these themes around like voyeurism and being perceived, and how that's juxtaposed with media's influence on how we perceive the world and ourselves. And there's just so many really interesting things you do with that, from like webcam, like seeing somebody through a webcam or like seeing somebody through a video, the commercials. I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about that aspect of the book that I'll let you decide what that means exactly.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of like really weird kind of voyeurism stuff in this book. And there are all sorts of characters that sort of like brush past one another and the reader doesn't really know. And I think that was something that I enjoyed playing with, you know, like a character like Duncan, he like live streams his whole life basically. And his life is boring. Like he's like an academic. All he does is sit around and like, you know, look at stuff on Google. Like he's not doing anything super fun. But then there's like Michaela, who is one of the many people who like actually like watches this stream, and like it is something that's like really comforting for her to just see this like boring black man just like living his life. You know, it's just like this I don't know, something very interesting to me about this sort of like ways that we're sort of connected to one another and not really know. That was sort of definitely something I was trying to play with. But yeah, I think just like, you know, the way that we understand so much is through like media representation, I think. And through the media, and like, you know, and how weird it is even that all we know is like through like CNN. It's like, does that mean that we know anything? I don't know. Like there's so many interesting questions about like, you know, we don't know anything about anything. I don't know. That's all I learn when I write, is that I don't know anything. Nobody knows anything.
Yeah. No, I really liked there's a moment where two characters like exchange their webcams. And again, knowing that it's not, you know, it is this mundane, it's like deeply mundane. They're just watching each other, like going through cooking noodles or whatever. Yeah. But it also feels like kind of sweet. And so I don't know. I'm wondering if you can talk about like part of what, and I think, you know, you talked about this at the top with like putting out a piece of writing and it's going out into the void. Part of what a lot of these characters want is just like to be seen, like that like your life exists when it's being observed or acknowledged in some way. And I think the webcam like really captures that.
Yeah, I know. I think that's definitely something that I don't know. The idea of like visibility as like existence. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's so many. Yeah, I don't even know where to go with that, but it's an interesting observation that you've had. But I don't know if I have any interesting things to say about it.
Okay.
Well, I think like to broaden the scope a bit about My Volcano, and then maybe we can get into some like your process or other creative journey. One thing I was thinking about, you've talked kind of a bit about it. A couple weeks ago, Ben and I talked to Eliza and Eric from $2 Radio, and we were just like learning a little bit more about how $2 came to be and kind of Eric's ethos in terms of picking up books and things like that to publish. For something like My Volcano, which I think you have even said in an interview, it's like hopefully the weirdest book somebody ever reads. I'm curious like what that submission process was like in terms of getting My Volcano out there.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was going to be a lot easier to sell than it was. It sold very quickly to people that I trust. I mean, that's at the end of the day. But I think I actually thought that it was going to be like, yeah, it's a super weird book. But it's like very, it's weird. I mean, there are weirder books, but I think there are weirder books that people read and they're just like, eh. Like, it's probably the weirdest I want it to be the weirdest book that people read and don't feel like completely alienated by. Because there are some very alienating weird books, and I love some of them. But so I don't necessarily think it should be the weirdest book that people read. But yeah, I mean, it was. I mean, I honestly, I talked about how all I do is write for myself. So I'm always a little bit disappointed when like don't get as many offers as you think you should. Cause I'm like, I wrote this amazing book cause I'm like my number one reader and my number one fan. And I was like, how is this not selling? I don't know. And I think, so we sent it to so many people, and Arsenal came with the best deal in Canada, which is great. They did my first novel, and I was very happy to do this novel with them as well. And $2 was very enthusiastic very soon, and turned out to be pretty much the only offer in the U.S. from it. So I don't know. It was somewhat deflating, but at the end of the day, I was very happy with where it ended up, because there were two people that I trusted so deeply to not screw it up. And like, I think I also so much believe in this book that like, I think it could be a success. And I'm glad that if it is, it's not like some conglomerate that's making money off of me. Like I'd rather get Arsenal and $2 Radio some money. So here's hoping that it takes off.
Yeah, can you maybe talk about that process of how do you find publishers, and like how do you think about again when you're thinking about like a pitch, how does that go, and who do you go to?
Yeah. Well, thankfully I had an agent for this one, so she did a lot of that work. But I think at the end of the day, like I published my first book with Arsenal. It took me a while because I'm prideful in my own way, and I want, at the end of the day, what I want is like my book to have the most possibility to reach the most amount of people. Like that's what I care about more than I care about, any sort of prestige. So that's really what I prioritize. And that's why I went with Arsenal, because they have good distribution in the US, and my first book was distributed in the US with them, which is great. And that's really like at the core of like what I look for. Like I won't go to a press that I don't believe will actually be able to like put my book in front of people. Like I don't want to have to be like solely my own like marketing manager. Like,
Right.
I mean, I'm very bad at selling myself in some ways. And I think it's also like, I want my book to just exist in this way that like, it doesn't have to do with me. Like, that's really the dream, is like, this book will just like go out there and live its life. And, it might write me a postcard every few years, but like, otherwise, like, it doesn't need me to sort of sustain itself. So like the big distribution, or like decent distribution, is really what I care about the most. And also I think like, obviously, like, a publisher who's like committed to, publishing more people, like diverse people. And like, Arsenal is, you can't get better than Arsenal when it comes to that. And 2L Radio is also really good about that. I mean, it comes with being a smaller publisher. You can take more risks, but yeah, I mean, just like those are the main things that I'm sort of looking for. And there's just the authenticity. I mean, you can't get much more authentic than Eric and Eliza.
Yeah.
And then also Arsenal is very authentic as well. So that's really like, to my own sort of marketable detriment, maybe, like I feel like that's so much what I'm going to prioritize in my career, is like publishing with people who I want to be successful with, rather than who will make me successful.
No, I mean, I think that's just so important to hear, that kind of your ethos behind it. I mean, I went to a master's and an MFA, like between prose writing and nonfiction, and it's like, I don't know what your experience was, but I feel like in both of my programs, the talks around publishing and, if we want to call it quote unquote professionalization, or whatever kind of sterile term we want to use. Yeah. I feel like there's this no knowledge from a lot of like the faculty in terms of giving it to students. So I really appreciate like kind of hearing that kind of behind the scenes in terms of how you're navigating these kinds of situations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the worst things that MFA programs do. Like they're the worst at just being able to, or any sort of like academic program, like they're weirdly like never prepare you to actually like be a professional in the world, or like like we had some agent meetings at my school, like that's as much as we really did. But I was woefully unprepared, I think, compared to probably anyone who's like knowledgeable of the literary world. Like I don't think I had a very good grasp of like what I was looking at. I think also they kind of like fluff you up a little and make you think that you're gonna, get this big book deal. And like, at the end of the day, like that's not even, they never give you a sense of like the options and like, is that what you want? Like I've seen plenty of people who get big book deals and they never ever publish another book again. So like, I don't know, there's ways that can really like ruin your career as well. Like you get a lot of money once, but if you don't make that money back, you might never make money again. Like, I don't know. There's all sorts of, there's all sorts of conversations about, professionalism, as we said, sterile professionalism that just, they definitely don't do a good job, I think, across the board in terms of preparing people for like what it's actually like. Because I mean, I was shocked when I went to grad school and I thought I was going to be the the like least published person there, and like I had like 3 publications or something, and like nobody had ever like submitted before, and I'm like, oh, I guess I had like a prof in undergrad that like actually like told us to like submit to things and made us like do book reviews for venues and stuff like that. And it's like, oh, okay, I actually like learned a little bit of like how to get a foot in the door in a way that like, I don't know, you just don't. And even at the end of the MFA, like, I don't think we did that much in terms of improving that for people, which I think is really frustrating.
Yeah, that's basically my experience too. Like during my master's, I came in with a couple of publications, and I felt kind of like the odd one out to a lot of the people in my cohort, and for the exact same reason that you were saying, of like I had a professor in undergrad who just did the extra work of kind of leading me down that path. One thing I'm always interested in is for people after they've kind of they're done with grad school, is stuff like My Volcano or Vanishing Monuments, is that pretty, are these works pretty indicative of what you were working on in grad school, or do you think you kind of your writing changed a lot after?
I think I was also very lucky to sort of go into grad school with a sense of conviction already. Like I saw plenty of my friends go in a little bit more uncertain, and you get really bent and coiled and like stretched in weird ways if you don't feel like you really like have a center. I think when it comes to going to grad school, like you can really mess you up. Like I've had friends who it took years for them to recover from like the way that their writing had been like distorted through grad school and like pulled away from their own sort of like center. So I think I was a little bit more mature in terms of my voice, in terms of like what I wanted to do. I mean, I think that obviously like in grad school was also kind of when I came to terms a little bit more with my queer identity and all that sort of stuff. So I think a lot of the stuff that came after that was, I think, a little bit more authentic to those sorts of experiences, and so those sorts of like characters, like that sort of stuff just bled more like actively into my work after grad school, because grad school was also not a place that I probably would have been able to, like, it was a very straight, very, very white, very straight, very, Long Island sort of experience. Like it was very much like a certain kind of environment that like, I don't think I could have really like come to terms with that there. So I think a lot of that sort of personal work definitely came after grad school, because that was just when I was sort of the most coming to terms with that. But I think, there are many things I wrote in grad school. Like, I started writing My Volcano in grad school. I started, Vanishing Monuments was technically my thesis, except I made it better after it was my thesis. I eventually need to break into my school and go burn my thesis to make sure that like nobody reads it. But I think that's. Yeah, I think there was a lot of like, the surreality, the surrealness, the weirdness, like that stuff is all sort of just things that I've sort of dabbled with. I sort of go in ebbs and flows, or it's like, a really realistic thing and then a really strange thing. Like I like to sort of dabble in all those things. So I think there's a lot of reflection of sort of styles that I had in grad school, but obviously like a lot of the stuff that I've written since then is a lot more authentic and a lot more intense and a lot more, I think, human in a way that's really good. Yeah. But
The biggest post grad school change that I've noticed is I think my approach to reading is like kind of getting back to normal, where it's like I think just you do that, a lot of really intensive reading, and you're like, I think I hate reading now. Yeah. And only recently I've come back. I'm wondering, what kind of influences you look to, what sort of things you read, what are the things that you approach, and are you someone who likes to read stuff that you can pull from, that you can kind of feel like, okay, this is a style I want to emulate, or this is something that I'm interested in? Or are you someone who is like, what is the most off the wall, so different from my interests in terms of, what I want to read?
Yeah. I mean, I've had a very bad few years for reading, so I don't, so it's like a hard question for me just because the pandemic has just been really difficult. I think that the thing I respond to the most with reading is stuff that just feels really real, and not even the sense that it feels like realism, but like just stuff that feels so like it just hits you in the gut. Like I think that's the thing I always kind of like turn to reading to remind me of, because I can get very carried away with my premises and sort of like lose the sort of anchor of like the humanity that I'm like at the core I'm always, I think, trying to strive towards. Like I'm trying to write these books that are very, like my Volcano, I wanted to write a book that was very weird and very interesting, but I also wanted to feel like there were like real people involved, even though, you know, there's so many of them. Like I wanted you to actually be able to connect with some of these characters, despite the fact there's so many and it might bounce around a lot. Like I wanted you to feel like anchored in that. So I think a lot of my reading, like those are the things that I respond to the most. I don't think I'm very susceptible to influence in terms of like voice or form. I mean, sometimes, you know, if I read something that's really voicey, I might get really like voicey in whatever I'm writing, but I don't think it's usually just, and honestly, like the books that I love the most and that make me want to write the most are the ones that I never finish, because whenever I read them, I'm just like, I'd rather be writing. Like this is just getting me so excited about the idea of writing. I think whenever I see someone doing something that is really exciting with language and with like structure, especially stuff like that, like, you know, like Wittgenstein's Mistress by David Markson is such a weird book, but it like makes me just want to write instead of read it. Like it's just because of the way that book, you know, sort of like my Volcano in the sense of like many weird things sort of next to each other and there's all these interesting threads. But yeah, I think that's like structural stuff, I think gets me really excited and makes me want to go write instead of read. So oftentimes the books that I'm like the most jazzed about, I'll like have never finished. Which is sad.
You're talking about structure, and I'm wondering. So I have a buddy who it's like just cannot give himself an easy time. It's like each he's like, what's the most interesting, convoluted, difficult way to structure a thing? Because it's like then it becomes, I think, a puzzle to solve in some ways.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what is your relationship to thinking about structure? Is it this kind of like, oh, I want to find something that's going to be interesting and engaging, or how do you think about like what to choose and what to pick?
I mean, I think it just has to speak to the work in some way. Like that's the thing that matters. Like I could write a story. Like I have a novel that is like a diary that's like very linear, like beginning to end, and like it has its own sort of like structural quirks to it. In its own way, but like I don't think it's always important to like write something that's very weirdly structured. I think sometimes like a fairly standard structure, or this sort of like, you know, a lot of my like short stories do this sort of like present past. Like that's sort of what my first novel does as well, but as well as having some sort of interesting sort of surreal refrains through it. So I think that's, I don't want the structure to ever come first is the problem. Like that's the difficult like puzzle. Like how can I make this more difficult for myself? Like it makes it interesting, but interesting doesn't make it necessarily like feel like something that's emerged from the work itself. Like it should be part of the, you know, the thing about the weird structure of my Volcano, it works very well with my Volcano. I would not necessarily recommend it for another kind of book because it works, like it's very much part of the thematic sort of structure of the book is this structure. Like the structure gives the piece more meaning. I think that's really what I look for in terms of structure, and what makes that sort of search for structure the most engaging is like, how can I find the thing that speaks to this work and makes it sort of more energetic maybe for me. Like it is engaging. I do like the puzzle. Like it was a very interesting book to put together. Like I think it was a fun kind of challenge in some ways to sort of structure this book. So I think that's definitely like, you know, part of it is the challenge, but I think more than anything, it has to sort of come from the heart of the book. And if that's not where it's coming from, you're just gonna write a book that is in a structure for some reason, and that will no shade on your friend, like, but like no, I mean, you know, I think that makes it more difficult to me if it doesn't feel like it's sort of authentic to the book itself, or it's not. Like, I want to see the structure as the thing that makes the book say, like, it's like a megaphone. Like, it's like the book is saying its thing, but this is what also just makes it even louder, the thing that it's saying. It's like the way that it's being said. So I think it has to really, like, come down to emerge from the idea itself and sort of, like, what you want to portray.
maybe this is a selfish question, but Ben and
I
I
love
are
selfish
both
questions.
Ben and I are both working on these longer projects, and just speaking
You can
for
call
my-
them novels. It's okay.
No,
novels,
longer
whatever.
projects.
I think that like I feel like a confident writer when I'm working in creative nonfiction, maybe to a lesser extent in short stories. But when I'm finding that this like novel writing is such a not only is it a difficult process, but I feel like it's really reveals a lot about my own relationship to writing and how I think about narrative and form and ways that I don't get from maybe these other genres. I'm curious for you, this is kind of twofold. Does novel writing feel I'm just gonna use natural, so maybe a bad way of phrasing it, but does it feel natural, or like does it feel comfortable in some ways for you? And two, now that My Volcano is kind of about to be out there, you're done with that book. Maybe what's something that you're taking away from that experience, finishing that novel?
Yeah. Okay. What was the first part of the question again?
Yeah, basically.
You can cut this part, but
yeah, basically, like with novel writing, is it something that
does it feel natural? Yeah. I think novel writing, it definitely doesn't. I don't think it should have felt natural because it wasn't a thing that I did for a very long time. Like I wrote short stories, I wrote poetry for so long before I really I'd sort of like played at the idea of writing a novel, but something about it just never quite sit. It's not an easy. I think the thing about the novel is that you can't cheat it. You can't fake your way through a novel. Like you have to just sit there and write the freaking novel. Like that's at the end of the day, you have to be able to like sit there and do it. I think that thinking about things like the structure and all of these sort of other things that can happen. I think the thing that's so scary about a novel as a form is like, unlike a short story, a novel, for the most part, can be anything. Like it can contain anything. It can do anything. Like it's a very versatile form, which is very exciting for me and also very terrifying for me and probably very terrifying for you. Like you could pretty much do anything and you're like, have to sort of choose what box to sort of set yourself. Like, okay, I'm just going to do this kind of novel. Even though you can kind of like play around. Like, I think it's hard to feel constrained in a novel in a way that like a short story, like once you hit like 7,000 words, you'd be like, well, I better wrap it up. Like, it's like, I can't get much more long if I'm going to publish it. Like, I mean, even that's a little bit unpublishable, but I think that the lack of like, I mean, there's all sorts of like clear ideas about like, plot and stuff, I guess, if you believe in plot, that like you can sort of lay upon yourself and be like, all right, this is what my novel needs to do. But I think the sort of freedom of the novel is definitely one of the most paralyzing things about it. Like it's very difficult to sit down and write a novel because of just how much it can contain everything. So I think that, and I think moving forward, I mean, My Volcano was a book that I definitely like was more, I mean, I'm always very self-indulgent with my writing. Like I'm writing for myself, like, and I say that, but I'm also writing about like, for someone who like has an idea of like what like is social justice for myself. Like there is a very social element for my book. Like they're very political in their own ways. But at the end of the day, like I'm writing this book because I think it's interesting to me and I think it's enjoyable for me, or it's me working through something for myself. Like I think and My Volcano was such a self-indulgent book in terms of just like allowing myself to dip my toe into all these sort of different genres and different sort of like weird things that I was write this made up faked Kafka story. Like I was like, I like Kafka, I love the Metamorphosis, like I'm gonna mess with that. So I'm like, that was just like, there was a lot of this book that was just like, I want to write something and I'm gonna set an insane premise and see if I can make it work. Like that was part of the enjoyment of it. So I think like from this, if I've learned anything, is just like to try to lean in as much as possible into those things that really get me excited. Because I think in some ways, occasionally I'll get sort of distracted and think too much about like what a book should be like, or like what like a serious literature might be like. Like I think my first book maybe is a little bit more. It is a little surreal though, so I don't want to say that it's not surreal in its own way, but I think I might have held back from that a little bit more than I needed to in some ways. I don't know. But yeah, it's a lot of it. Yeah, I don't think it's a natural form for me. And I think what's so exciting about it is how unnatural it is. Because I sort of like, it is that sort of puzzle because of that, because you kind of have to figure it out as you go. So it's a very interesting kind of, and it's so immersive. I mean, like, that's the best thing about the novel as well. Like, I don't think I could really go back to short stories simply because being stuck in a novel is unlike being stuck in anything else. Like, it's just especially in our freaking world, like being able to sort of like slip into this other thing, sort of parallel universe where things are a little bit more in control or a little bit more predictable or unpredictable in more interesting ways, or more beautifully put, at least, like where the pain is still there, but it's not in this sort of like blunt force trauma sort of way. Like it's at least like hurting me in a way that like I can respect it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's really hard. It's really natural for me now, I think, more than it was before I'd written a novel. Like now I don't know, like I go in to write a short story, I'm like, what's the point? I don't know. Like you can only do so much. Like it's too easy in some ways. Like I can get in and out, and I kind of, the process is so enjoyable to me of a novel.
I love
so
that.
Enjoy it.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
That's something I feel like I could just put that on repeat and
Yeah.
with some headphones. That was really good.
Is there something we haven't asked you, that you wanna say, maybe especially about the book, but or about the process?
I don't know. Not really. Because there's so much. I mean, the thing about my Volcano is like we could talk about so many things. Like there's so many weird sort of, there's like folk tales and myths and like magic and aliens and all of these things included in this book. Like it's hard to start going down a path without being like, well, let's just keep going, I will say, if anyone reads this book and thinks like, how can you write something like this, you might look into Scrivener, because that's the only way. That's the thing that has made writing novels a lot more natural to me, because it is a non-linear writing application, and like that was a way that I was able to sort of unlock this freedom to sort of write this thing and know that I don't have to put it right where it is in like the Word document. Like in a Word document, it would just be the next part of the page, and it's easy to move stuff around and all that sort of stuff. And there's all sorts of like metadata that I can track with this book specifically. There's so many different labels, so many different things that I was dealing with, just to sort of be able to visualize what's going on. So I think that really was something that when I picked that up for finishing, I did this thing with Vanishing Monuments where I wrote it non-linearly. So I had all these like threads, like this is like this thread from beginning to end. This is this thread from beginning to end. I printed it all out, put it on the floor, and was like, if I have to reorganize this shit in Microsoft Word, I'm going to jump off a bridge. Like I cannot do that. So that was like the way that I finally like justified learning Scrivener, because it allowed me to move things around a lot more easily. And that's sort of so much the way that my brain wants to write, I think. So it's much nicer to be able to have this place where I don't have to feel like I'm like locked in on like what is next, but rather like what do I want to write? Like what's like an interesting thing that I can do to like, sometimes I have to write something interesting that's like 50 pages later or like 100 pages later, just so I have like something to go towards. It's like that'll be meaningless if I don't write the stuff in between then. So it's a way that I've sort of made my brain work for writing a novel. So that's definitely something that's made it more natural. So unsponsored plug for Scrivener if that's something that you need. I think it's something that you'd very much, for the most part, don't need if you write a certain kind of book, or if you write really linearly, like you don't need it. But if you need it, you need it. So worth checking out if that's how you want to write.
That's all we have for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, this has been awesome. Thanks for having me.
And that was our conversation with John Elizabeth Stintzi about their new novel, My Volcano. This was a really fun conversation. I think Jess is really honest and open about kind of their creative process and the trouble, I think, of writing a novel like My Volcano, which is kind of hard to parse and hard to grasp hold of. I think like if you were to, as you heard us in the intro, if you were to try to describe
scrambling, floundering,
you'd be like, yeah, you'd be like flailing in the ocean. You know, it's not like an easy task to pitch this book, and I think Jess, you know, speaks to that in terms of like, how do you find a publisher for something weird like this?
Yeah, and I think we got into this conversation because, you know, we've been having this conversation with a lot of authors at this point, which is, how do you pitch your thing? What is the market for it? How do you think about, are you thinking about the market? And I think they just had a very good perspective on like, and again, we keep hearing this repeated, which is just like, write the book that you want to write and like write the thing that you want to write, and don't worry too much about, you know, audience or who it's for. It's for you at the end of the day. And just be confident in the story that you're telling. And as much as that advice, I think sometimes pains me because it boils down to just write it. And I think we both hate hearing that because, you know, it could be a bit of a
it's hard shit.
It's a speed bump to get over sometimes.
Yeah.
But no, it's good to hear that. I think that advice again, where it's just like, nah, just like sit down, write this thing.
Yeah, I think also just reflecting on the conversation, one thing that was, I don't know, like good to hear or eye-opening, I don't know how I'd phrase it, is hearing Jess's kind of process in writing the novel and how it kind of had a really long gestation period where they were working on other things, and then, you know, they'd come back and peck away at this book and maybe write something else. Like the non-linearity of you know, writing a novel, and especially one like this, I think that's something that maybe I need to hear. You know, like there's always like a sense of urgency to like, oh, I need to like do this thing now, and it needs to be all like, this is what I'm working on, and then once this is done I can move on to something else. When it's like, no, like maybe in some ways it's more healthy to like try other things.
No, you and I were literally, I feel like we were having this conversation, was it 2 weeks ago? It might have been a week ago, where we were talking about, so we are both working on writing. Is it anything? Is it a novel? I'm not going to say. But, and I was just kind of talking about, I've actually, one of the things I've started doing is just skipping over, because so often I feel like I'm writing scene to scene, and I feel like I have to write completely in a kind of, this is how it's going to be read. It's going to be completely linear. And it feels, you know, when you get to those places where you're like, I don't know what to do next, or I don't know how to write myself through this scene, it stalls me out basically every time. And it sucks. And I think what I recently did is I was like, I don't know how to write this next part. And then I just skipped over it and wrote the part after it. And I was like, oh, maybe I should just be doing this all the time. And I think I heard in Jess's advice a lot of that, where they were basically just like, yeah, I found like I wanted to write this part. Like I had this weird scrap of a thing that I wanted to work on. And so I did. And turns out it fit into this novel that I was working on. So I think that approach and that kind of encouragement I found incredibly useful.
Yeah, like even just hearing you communicate that, it's making me think of like, if I were to analog novel writing to like making a puzzle, it's like that first chapter is kind of like the border. Like when you make a puzzle, you do the border pieces around so you can kind of have that little frame that you can work within. But then after that, it's not like when you're doing a puzzle, you just go like straight down line for line, putting in the pieces until the puzzle's done, right? You kind of like jump around. You put in a puzzle piece here, you put in a puzzle piece there. And sometimes for whatever reason, that, you know, makes you see where another piece might go on a different part of the puzzle. And I think the same is true to what Jess is talking about, where like sometimes you need to work on another part to understand that there's a missing piece somewhere else. And like to hear, like, for instance, that some of the main characters in My Volcano, like some of the main components of that came at the very end of the writing process. It's like, damn, okay, maybe it makes it a little bit more approachable, maybe is what I'm saying.
Phil, I'm not trying to gas you up at all. I want to be real clear about that, but that was like kind of profound. That was good. The bit about the puzzle, that was good.
And, a clock is right. What is it? Twice a day or whatever. So that's my gold.
Wow. Do you
day.
teach writing classes? What's going on?
Yeah. So, ultimately great conversation. And it's always good to kind of just talk about these conversations afterwards. I feel like I always learn a little bit more about the thing that we talk to them about after the fact. So, if you all want to check out my Volcano, you can find it again, probably anywhere from Amazon to $2 Radio to your local bookstore. Also check out Jess's website, which is johnelizabethstintzi.com, as well as their Twitter, which is at Jess, Jes, Stintzi. You can find me at 3D Cisco on Twitter. And we wanted to take a moment and thank Ryan Hopper for providing the awesome intro and outro music you hear every episode, as well as Melody Hirsch, who did the website and cover art for us.
You can find me at sad_radio_lad, and you can email us with questions, comments, any kind of feedback to theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. Our website is originstory.show, and our Twitter is at originstory_. But what you would like to do, what I would like to have, is maybe just a couple of reviews, just a little something in the till to make me feel good, because, nothing hurts more for me personally than when I pull up iTunes and I scroll down to the reviews and there's nothing there,
We've been looking at the same great reviews.
Excellent. Whoa, to be clear, delightful, artistically written.
For months. We need some new ones. And the listeners count has gone up a lot since those. So we need people to tell us what you're feeling about the show. We're always trying to, make it better. And I think, as we said in the interlude episode before the start of this season, we're really interested in just trying some new things with the show outside of just the conversational episodes. So if you have suggestions, if you have things that you don't like, we'd love to hear those. So definitely let us know through the reviews and through our email.
More reviews means more cheddar. More cheddar means that we can finally devote some coin towards the CGI budget that we're hoping to bring to Origin Story.
If we can get the cheddar, then we can do a video podcast, and we'll have the budget to actually CGI hair onto Ben's head.
I am completely bald. That's true. You're fucking dead for that.
So with that, we will see you all on the next episode of Origin Story.